Everyone, and welcome to the Workplace Safety North webinar, How to Prepare for Ontario Workplace Inspections on Hazardous Materials Training and Worker Exposure to Chemical Agents. My name is Paige Jones, and I'm the event specialist here at Workplace Safety North. We appreciate your attendance here today and want to mention a few items before we get started. Your microphones have been muted, and we ask that you use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen for speaker questions. Questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded. A link to the recording, a copy of the presentation, and resource information will be sent to you within a few days. So today we are joined by Judith Nelson from Workplace Safety North and Ina Commission from the Ministry. And I'll pass it over to Ina to begin today's presentation. Welcome.
Thanks, and thanks very much to WSN for supporting our inspection campaign and allowing us the opportunity to talk about it a little. The vision of the Fair, Safe, and Healthy Workplaces Division of the Ministry of Labour, Immigration, Training, and Skills Development is to make Ontario the most attractive place to work in the world because every employee is treated fairly and comes home safely. To do that, we set, communicate, and enforce legislation to help make Ontario workplaces fair, safe, and healthy. And our disclaimer, the purpose of today's presentation is to assist workplace parties in understanding their obligations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act and its regulations. It's not intended to replace the Act or the regulations, and you should always refer to the official version of the legislation. It's the responsibility of workplace parties to ensure compliance with the legislation, and this presentation is certainly not legal advice. For legal advice, please contact your legal counsel. Also, Ministry of Labour, Immigration, Training, and Skills Development inspectors will apply and enforce the Occupational Safety and Health Act and its regulations based on the facts as they find them in any workplace, and this presentation doesn't affect their enforcement discretion. So today, what we want to cover is talk a little bit about who the Ministry of Labour, Immigration, and Training, Ministry of Labour, Immigration, Training, and Skills Development occupational hygienists are. We do have 2 workplace inspection campaigns going on this year for 2024-2025 fiscal year, and we'll cover the campaign information, worker exposure to chemical agents, and also, yes, WHMIS updated training requirements. And WSN will provide information about training and resources that may help you to comply with these requirements of these campaigns. So who are we? The occupational hygiene consultants of the ministry work in the Specialized Professional Services Unit. The SPS unit also includes engineers, medical consultants, infection control specialists, and our role really is to provide technical support to ministry inspectors. So they don't have to know everything about every special topic. We can provide specialized support to them on specific topics. But we also, the hygienists, also conduct inspections, investigations, and sometimes we do air sampling. We call that an industry-wide air quality survey. And that's really to identify risk factors that might contribute to occupational disease and illnesses in work. We focus on industrial hygiene in order to protect workers from chemical, biological, and physical agents that could make them ill. And we do follow the annual health and safety inspection compliance plan that's published by the ministry. That's a public document. You can see that, and the link in the presentation will take you to the plan. The ministry occupational hygiene specialists focus on certain regulations that deal with occupational hygiene issues. So, for example, Regulation 833, control of exposure to biological or chemical agents, and Regulation 860, Workplace Hazardous Materials Information System, or the WHMIS regulation, are the two regulations that are the focus of these two campaigns. But we'll also, always look at the requirements for the noise regulation, the confined space regulation, and the designated substance regulations. And recently, we also obtained responsibility for another regulation, the X-ray safety regulation. So we'll always be looking at the requirements of those regulations when we're in your workplace doing an inspection. In addition to that, there are quite a few sections in the industrial regulation, the mining regulation, the construction regulation, and the healthcare regulation that deal with occupational hygiene issues in workplace. So we'll also, look at and enforce those. Okay, the timelines for our compliance campaign, our inspection campaigns. The campaigns last all year. We're in phase 1 right now. Phase 1, which started April the 1st, 2024, and lasts to the end of the fiscal year, March 31st, 2025, is the education and outreach phase. So during this time, ministry hygienists may inform workplace parties that this campaign is taking place, and our inspections will start in July. Our system partners, including WSN, will also be promoting the campaign during this period. The enforcement part of the campaign starts on July the 2nd and runs to March 31st, 2025. That means the active inspections will start taking place July 2nd. These will be proactive inspections, and we'll look at workplaces where these regulations apply, which is nearly every workplace in Ontario. There's no specific focus on any particular exposure, job task, or industry. Forestry workplaces, such as sawmills, pulp and paper mills, silviculture operations, logging operations, arborists will all be included in this inspection program. So what are the topics of the campaign? As I said, there are two. Let's talk about worker exposure to chemical agents in the workplace first. So here's I was going to talk about the picture page. Thanks, Paige. So the picture is an image from a wood preservative plant. So for sure, chemicals used in the preservation of lumber and other wood materials. Go ahead. So the rationale for the campaign, why is this topic chosen for an inspection campaign? Well, the whole purpose is to lower the risk of injury and occupational illness from chemical exposures. Workplace information is also needed by the ministry as part of one of the goals in our 5-year Prevention Works strategy. So one of those goals is to develop an exposure surveillance system for Ontario workers. As part of that, we need to collect information on what are workers exposed to and what is the level of exposure. And we'll think about exposure by all routes, inhalation, skin contact, or ingestion, because any route of exposure can cause a worker to acquire an occupational illness or have an injury. And the active links in this presentation take you to the strategy, the Prevention Work strategy, and occupational illness information from a workplace health and safety system partner. I'll provide to Paige a link also to our occupational illness information, which explains what an occupational illness is. It's a physical condition diagnosed by a doctor that impairs a worker from doing their work and is caused by exposure to a chemical, physical, or biological agent at the workplace. And also the link I will provide takes you to an online reporting system. Okay, thanks. What are the effects of exposure? Well, in the short term, exposure to chemical agents can cause respiratory, skin, and eye irritation, or effects like headache, dizziness, and nausea. But it's really long-term effects that can lead to occupational disease. And that could be a lung disease, a disease of any other part of the respiratory system, skin sensitization, dermatological illnesses, effects on organs or on body systems, and even cancer.
Thanks, Aina. So just some examples what you could see at your workplaces. For inhalation, we see that wood dust, of course, handling wood would generate wood dust. Workers are exposed to wood dust during cutting, sanding wood, especially if you have a fine wood shop you have where you're actually sanding dry material, like a carpenter shop, for example. Large amount of airborne particulates, dry wood is generated. But also look at the manufacturing process, for example, conveyor areas. So if you have a paper mill, you have extensive conveyor areas to move that pieces of bark material or wood chips into the mill. Also, conveyor areas when they are processing the logs and woods. Dust, when we're looking at dust exposure, we could just talk about the general dust exposure. Even as simple as that, the yard workers can be exposed during the dry, hot summer days. They are moving back and forth with the equipment, and lots of times they're keeping their windows down. So during that time, they can be exposed to significant amount of dust. Maintenance shops, for example, where they're doing cutting, grinding, and other activities. Or for example, if a process requires mixing of glue, the additives can be very fine particulates. So during glue mixing, we could also generate lots of airborne particulates. Metal fumes is very prevalent actually with the wood and paper pulp industry because the processes require lots of or cause lots of breakdowns. So we have lots of millwrights, for example, or professional welders, or even mechanics who conduct lots of hot work activities. During those hot work activities, metal fumes are liberated and workers can be exposed to those elements. Also, if the place has a shop area where they're processing or doing the guides and blades, they have to melt raw material to create guides or sharpen blades, for example. Some other exposures, diesel, it's very prevalent in mechanical shops. There is lots of tents. I noticed instead of fixed shops, there is tents, which is able to house large size equipments. So during run checks, workers and mechanics are exposed to diesel fumes. Gases and fumes, of course, generated during hot work activities. So again, potential CO exposure is there. I do see lots of exposure hazard to CO in warehouses where workers are operating propane forklifts and they're going in and out from tractor trailers or trail cars. There is not much ventilation is happening. Also, we have volatile organic compounds. It's liberated anytime when we have organic material is processed. So that's something too we have to consider when we're looking at worker exposure. Biological hazards, again, we have to keep in mind that we are processing a live material, organic material. So we could have molds and other microorganisms on the wood itself, but also during the process, we could generate, or in a very humid, hot environments, mold could grow very easily. So we have to look at potential skin contact, liquids and solids, solvents, for example, mechanical shops. That picture is actually shows, representing lots of time when I am going to shops. Mechanics don't like to use sometimes gloves. It's important to use proper PPE, not to have those skin contacts with those fluids. And of course, the wood dust itself, could cause some dermal reactions. So especially if people have some existing conditions, could aggravate that. Biological hazards, insects and fungi, again. So when we're touching these surfaces or workers are exposed to it, potential could be a problem. Ingestion, we do see some poor hygiene practices. And usually, when people are going for a smoke or eat in a work environment, we do see that people are not washing their hands as they should, and they could bring this contamination inside their body.
So what can you expect when we visit your workplace during an inspection? The purpose of the inspection is to assess compliance with Regulation 833, control of exposure to biological or chemical agents. We'll look at whether employers are taking every measure reasonable in the circumstances to protect workers from exposures. That could include respiratory protection, safe work procedures, ventilation, and so on, whatever measure is reasonable in the circumstances as required under Section 3 of 833. A really key part of this campaign, though, is ensuring that worker exposures are below the Ontario occupational exposure limits that are laid out by Section 4 of the regulation. So what are the occupational exposure limits in Ontario? Many workplaces may have not done any air sampling before for workplace exposures. The Ontario OELs, or occupational exposure limits, are maximum airborne concentration limits for a specific air contaminant allowed in workplace air. And we have established OELs for approximately 700 different chemical agents. However, it's not a simple matter of measuring the chemical concentration in the air once and, at 1 second and 1 point in time and comparing it to the limit. What we're really interested in worker exposure throughout their full shift. So the limits, there are 3 types of limit. One is called a time-weighted average limit. This is a time-weighted average limit for a full work day or a full work week. There are also short-term exposure limits, which are established for periods of 15 minutes exposure. They're higher than the time-weighted average limits, but you can only be exposed to those higher concentrations up to 4 times in a work day, and there must be at least an hour in between those exposures. And those higher exposures are still included in the calculation of the time-weighted average limit, and that can't be exceeded. For some agents, there's no point talking about an average exposure because they're so smelly or they're so irritating that we just assign a ceiling limit. So a ceiling limit is the highest concentration that shouldn't be exposed, a worker shouldn't be exposed above at any moment in time. It's like a peak exposure limit. Where an agent has not been assigned a short-term exposure limit or a ceiling limit, there are excursion limits allowed. That means, yep, you can have exposures higher than the time-weighted average limit as long as certain rules are followed. One, of course, has to be included in the calculation of the time-weighted average, and the others are some values. So up to 3 times the value of the time-weighted average limit for periods lasting up to 30 minutes, any 30-minute period in a day, and up to 5 times the time-weighted average limit for any time. So a peak exposure limit of 5 times the TWA. For some agents, the limits are set out in the Ontario table, and that's included in Regulation 833. For some chemical agents, 833 adopts a set of threshold limit values published by the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, the ACGIH. So this is a research body that publishes recommended exposure limits every single year. They're reviewed every year and republished every year, sometimes revised. Our legislation currently adopts the 2017 publication of the ACGIH limits, and from time to time, the ministry reviews the exposure limits, and it may adopt a more recent version of the ACGIH TLVs. Just to make it easy on you, the Ontario occupational exposure limits are all posted on our website, and there's a live link on this page that'll take you to the listing for all of the approximately 700 agents. Okay, so don't run screaming from the room because there's a little bit of math on the page, but I thought there might be some value in including a sample calculation of time-weighted average exposure. We'll be looking at data in your workplace if you've done any sampling, and we'll be looking at how people are calculating time-weighted average exposure. So this example is for a worker who has an exposure to airborne softwood dust. And industrial hygiene consultant maybe took a measurement and found that the average exposure over the 12-hour work day was 4 milligrams of softwood dust in every cubic meter of air. 4 milligrams per cubic meter. Is this high allowable exposure? Well, at first glance, if you compare 4 milligrams per cubic meter to the exposure limit, which is a time-weighted average limit of 5 milligrams per cubic meter of air, it looks like it's lower, it looks like it's acceptable. But what you have to do is use the formula that's given in the Schedule 1 of Regulation 833 to calculate the worker's daily time-weighted average exposure. And this is given by this formula. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'll use it anyway. It makes me feel better. So you take the concentration that the worker is exposed to, so the measured value, multiply it by the time, which is the duration that we take that worker to have been exposed to that concentration. So in this case, there's only one concentration, and it was a duration of 12 hours. But you could have a situation where you make many measurements throughout the shift, and then you have to consider all the measurements. So the second concentration times the time that the worker is exposed to that concentration, and the third and the fourth and the fifth, and so on, as many as there are. We take the sum of all those calculated values and divide by 8, and that gives us the daily time-weighted average exposure. There's also a similar formula for calculating weekly exposure, where you take that cumulative exposure and divide by 40. But we'll stick to a daily TWA in this example. So in this example, the worker's daily time-weighted average exposure to softwood dust is 4 milligrams per cubic meter of air times 12 hours and divided by 8, which gives us a result of 6 milligrams per cubic meter of air. This means the worker's daily time-weighted average exposure to airborne softwood dust is 6 milligrams per cubic meter of air. And that's higher than the softwood time-weighted average limit of 5 milligrams per cubic meter of air. So we would consider that worker was overexposed in terms of the limit. They're not so scary. During inspections, how will we be able to identify chemical exposures in the workplace? Well, we'll certainly review safety data sheets and labels for any products that are being used. We'll have a look at how chemical agents are being used or involved in work processes by observing equipment, watching workers do their jobs, seeing what work practices they follow, and that will give us an idea of the potential for exposure to a chemical agent by inhalation, or by skin contact, or by incidental ingestion. For example, if a worker's painting and they're painting with a roller or a brush, then they may have a certain exposure to airborne vapor that evaporates from the paint as they use it. But the potential for exposure is very much higher if a worker is spraying the paint, where a lot of tiny droplets get into the air, forming an aerosol, and then each of those droplets can evaporate. So we'll think about and look at how workers are using the products or using the equipment in the workplace. If a workplace is doing their own monitoring of air quality or air quality testing, then we'll have a look at their equipment, and we'll in particular be looking at calibration equipment. There's a requirement in section 6 sub 2 of regulation 833 that says any workplace monitoring using direct reading devices like the one I show you on the bottom right image must be done in accordance with the manufacturer's instruction for use of the instrument and calibration of the instrument. If air monitoring has been done by the workplace or through a third-party consultant, we'll have a look at the results, and we'll collect and review other workplace information if we need it in order to see what workers might be exposed to. So there might be something, some work process that we don't get to see on a particular day, but we may ask for information so we can review. During inspections, the industrial hygienist will determine the level of exposure or the potential level of exposure. And how will we do that? Well, we may do some testing ourselves. We have fleets of direct reading instruments, and we can make simple short-term measurements, may give us a good enough idea about what's going on, or at least trigger the need for further testing. Since ventilation controls are really important to protect workers from exposure, we want to make sure they're working. So we have some simple devices to see whether ventilation systems are working. We may even test airflow at those devices to see if the capture velocity is sufficient. If you're trying to capture wood dust, for example, you need a much higher air velocity than if you're just capturing paint drying from a surface. We may issue requirements for the workplace to do air sampling, and we'll for sure look at what control measures are in place. That might mean we look at SOPs or just watch workers as they work. And if respiratory protection is used as a control measure for workers, then we'll have a look at the respiratory protection program. And 833, as well as regulation 490, the designated substance regulation, lay out the same requirements for respirators in workplaces, including having a written respiratory protection program, doing fit testing and training for workers, ensuring that workers take care of the respirators in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions, and all of the other requirements for respiratory protection in the workplace.
So what can you do to improve compliance at your place? These are some of the examples. And I just want to reiterate, you would think that wood dust is, we are exposed even at home sometimes with it, but we do have to take in consideration some of the workers are all day, 10, 12-hour shifts, they are exposed to these particulates. And it is a confirmed human carcinogen, for example, oak or beech wood types. So that's why we want to take it really seriously. We want to minimize the exposure on the workers. But what can you do? So for example, review the safety data sheet and labels in your workplaces. And look at the pictogram, for example. On a picture, you could see kind of that individual has this exploding lung. That kind of indicates that there is a severe or hazardous chemical is in that product. So something that you may want to look at more seriously when you see those labels. Another thing you could do is just a simple inspect fire cabinets, open them up, look inside, look at the chemicals, or do you have even accumulated liquids and things like that on the bottom of the those cabinets, fire cabinets. I do see them lots of times. All kinds of chemicals are mixed at the bottom from leaking from containers. So you do want to eliminate that. Also look at is all those chemicals has current safety data sheets. So lots of times, especially if you have contractors coming in shutdown periods to the sites, they do bring in their own chemicals, and lots of time those chemicals are left behind. So those chemicals end up in the safety in your fire cabinets, and you have no information on it. The hazards, for example, of that cabinet. So for that chemical agent. So make sure you have all the safety data sheets for all your chemicals. Audit your safety data sheets. We do see still very, very old safety data sheets, especially if there is provided in a printed copies at the sites. So open up those binders, for all your work areas and make sure they have the current safety data sheets. A quick way to recognize if it's the current one, look for that red diamond shape, and also look at how many sections the safety data sheet says. You should have 16 sections. Observe equipment, work tasks, practices. So go out in the field and watch people working. Look at if the workers are generating dust. So for example, you could go and check out your cleaning crew when they are shoveling or cleaning wood chips around conveyor areas or underneath the wood mills. Sometimes they do generate lots of dust, especially in hot days. So that's something you have to consider. How do you protect those workers? Not just from inhalation, but also we're looking at potential skin contact or even ingestion during work days. Conduct site visit. Are people wearing PPE correctly? I see many places where people actually wearing respirators, but they are not clean shaven, for example, or they're not wearing the proper cartridge for the agents they are using. So you might want to just check that out when you're doing your site visits. Are people using the dust control measures? So for example, if a worker has to use a dust collector or they have to use water to wet certain areas, is that actually being done? And if not, investigate why is it not? Maybe there is no water available for the workers to use as a dust control. So you have to look into it a little bit more details. Another good indication to look for potential chemical exposure is the storage areas. I see many places when we have chemical spillage on the ground or storage areas. That's also, you might want to look into it. Why is this happening? Perhaps during transportation or the storage container is not adequate for the chemical. So it's very visible when you see liquids pouring down on the side of the cabinets and things like that. Examine gas monitors and calibrate equipment. So as Aina mentioned that, these calibration equipment usually have calibration certificates with them. So when you have these equipments, just make sure you keep the calibration certificates on file. So this way you could verify that if the equipment that actually used was in good operating condition. Keep in mind the gas that you use for calibration does expire. So many multi-gas tanks contains 4 different types of gas, and usually those multi-gas tanks are expire 6 to 9 months. So it all depends what kind of gas you have in there. Just kind of mark when it's expired so it's clearly visible for the person when they're using it. Another question to ask, does the operator understand how the equipment is working? Does he know what is A1 alarm mean? What's happened when the first alarm goes on? What's happened when the second alarm goes on? And what is the worker supposed to do when those alarm comes on? Do I just push the button and silence the alarm and I go about my work, or do I have to do something else? So that's something too you might want to check. And again, this could be even observed during workday. If you see a the alarm goes off, if you observe the worker is actually following the instruction, what they're supposed to do. So again, you just want to make sure that workers understands how the equipment is working, what it is for. And now some of these equipments actually have some limitations too. So good to familiarize yourself about the limitations also. What can I do to improve compliance? For example, air monitoring. If you conduct air monitoring, but any type of monitoring, you have to make sure that you actually review those results with the workers. It is very important to be transparent with the workers and Joint and Health and Safety Committee, because if you're not sharing the results with the workers, it could be a mistrust. So it's just important when somebody's actually wearing an equipment or part of the assessment process, it's very important to share the information with that information, especially because they're part of the project. Joint and Health and Safety Committee, of course, is equally important. For another example, have recording updated within the last 12 months, or the workers training, any kind of policies or procedures. Area monitoring is a good start to identify exposure hazards. Sometimes, before we actually put personal monitoring equipment on the workers, we kind of want to see that what types of chemical exposure or could happen in the work environment. And lots of times we just hang on area monitor, just evaluate even what type of agent is in the air that we could potentially be measured. So area monitoring is also a good start to identify exposure hazards.
Great points about the air monitors, Judith. And, we really like full shift sampling as the best way to assess exposure. What else? During an inspection, if we happen to see non-compliance with the regulation 833, then what happens? Well, we might issue an order under the Occupational Health and Safety Act or under applicable regulations. The orders can be time-based. We'll work with the employer to determine a reasonable time in most cases. We're not unreasonable folks, and we want to let you help us figure out what's a reasonable timeline. In some cases, though, if it's determined to be a serious hazard, the order may be tied to a stop work order. And something that, can be used also is called a compliance plan. So a compliance plan order means that the employer, the workplace really, will develop a set of actions to comply with a particular order and specify a timeline. So what am I going to do and when am I going to do it by? And submit the plan order to the inspector. If the inspector accepts the plan, then they convert it to a time-based order with your own dates as the compliance dates. So a very useful tool for both parties, inspector and workplace, is the compliance plan order. To comply with the requirement for air sampling, if we need more information, we may issue a requirement for you to do more testing, and really that will likely involve retaining the services of a third-party consultant who's trained in occupational hygiene air sampling. In fact, Regulation 833 talks about any air sampling to determine worker exposure has to be done by or under the direction of a person who's qualified because of knowledge, training, and experience in the professional practice of occupational hygiene. Go ahead, Judith.
So how can WSN to support? We could conduct field visits and just walk around in your work areas and joined by Joint and Health and Safety Committee members or safety specialists, and just make general recommendations for improvements. I do that a lot, and it's very informal process. it's kind of an education on both sides. You know, I learn about your side, and then you also pick up some tips for IH topics. Exposure assessment. So we have a full fleet of equipment. On the top picture, actually see some of the equipments are deployed or going to be deployed in one of the work sites. You could see we have gravimetric sampling pumps there. We have dosimeters, we have gas equipment. So we will adjust, you know, to the organization, what they need for the assessment. We also conduct designated substance assessment in case you do have designated substances. Of course, it's not that prevalent with the wood and paper pulp input stick, but maybe you could have maybe potential lead exposure, you know, but not as much, for example, if you would have a mining industry. We could do gap assessment to look at your industry hygiene management system and identify, you know, some gaps where you could make some improvements. Develop training material, control programs and policies. If you cannot tackle that job, we could help you. Either I could coach you and go do it together with you, or if really, you know, you need 100% support, we could develop it for you. But ideally, we would want you to do it. Provide recommendations for sampling equipment. So for example, if you want to have your own, you want to do your own assessments done, and you're not sure, you know, what equipment should I use, what type of article service should I request for my samples, we could provide you some recommendation based on your needs of the exposure assessment. I do lots of time joint and health and safety committee meetings. I join for some of my clients where they have a chance to ask direct questions, especially if I'm involved with the process of the assessment. Sometimes it's nice to have that direct contact with them. You could review documentations. So let's say you have a respiratory protection program and you're not sure, you know, if you're missing something in it. No problem, we could look at it and we could give you some advice, you know, if you need to have some kind of update, some of the section on it. Some of my clients are looking for mentorship when they're doing the industrial hygiene work. So for example, if you want to do some assessment on field, I'm here and my colleague is here available to mentor some of those people if they request that.
Awesome. So that was the first inspection campaign on chemical exposures. The second campaign is on WHMIS training. Now, why would we ever do an inspection campaign on WHMIS training? Didn't we just do that when WHMIS was updated in 2015? Well, Health Canada is the federal government organization that writes the Hazardous Products Regulation and under the Hazardous Products Act that applies to suppliers. So the regulations determine what information has to be on labels and what information has to be in material safety data sheets. Health Canada revised the Hazardous Products Regulation in December of 2022. Suppliers have 3 years to comply with the amendments, and that period ends in December 2025. So within this 3-year period, your workplace could be receiving hazardous products that either meet the former Hazardous Products Regulations or the amended Hazardous Products Regulations. And if they meet the amended Hazardous Products Regulations, then you may need to update your WHMIS training. So you can't do this without being aware of what the changes are. And the changes involve changes in the way suppliers classify their products and in the information that must be provided on data sheets, among some other changes. A quick way to tell if you have a new safety data sheet that is following or attempting to follow the amended Hazardous Products Regulations is to look in section 9 of the data sheet, and there's a new heading called particle characteristics. So if you see that new heading, particle characteristics, in section 9 of your safety data sheets, then you want to look at potentially retraining workers in WHMIS so they understand the information provided by the supplier on the hazardous products. Go ahead. So for this inspection campaign, we're looking for compliance with Ontario Regulation 860, which is the WHMIS regulation. First of all, we have to see if there are any hazardous products used in the workplace, and hazardous product is specifically defined in the Hazardous Products Act. It's the term that we use for products that are WHMIS controlled products. And remember in 2015, this language was changed. We used to call these products WHMIS controlled materials. Now they're called hazardous products. So it's a very specific definition. We will, as part of this inspection campaign, ensure that safety data sheets are available to workers. That requirement is laid out by the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and we'll have a look at labels and safety data sheets to see if we can tell if they're compliant with the amended Hazardous Products Regulation requirements or not. We'll really have a look at worker WHMIS training. When's the last time you did WHMIS training? What kind of records do you keep? It's always a good idea to keep a WHMIS certificate or some proof or documentation that you have provided WHMIS training. And please remember there's two parts to WHMIS training. There's generic training that talks about the legislation and the requirements for labels and data sheets, but there's also your workplace specific information that needs to be provided to workers. Where is the emergency equipment? Where are the safety data sheets? What are the chemicals you are using in your own workplaces? And how do workers protect themselves? During inspections, we'll look at how chemical products are stored, handled, and used in the workplace. And, we see a lot of chemical product use in our inspections. So if we think there's an issue, we may ask to review the safety data sheet and see if the recommendations on the safety data sheet are being followed. And that's the best thing you can do, is review the recommendations on your safety data sheets and use the protective equipment, measures, and procedures that the supplier recommends. You know that there are different labeling requirements for tanks and piping systems than there are for actual containers of products. So we'll be looking at that. And we like to talk to workers about the products that they might be using at the time of the inspection. We'll ask them, what are the hazards of that product that you're using? How are you protecting yourself? And where will you go for more information? So we're hoping that they can tell us, oh, I'm going to use the safety data sheet, and there's the collection right over there. And as I said, we may look at the WHMIS training materials that you have reviewed.
So how can WSN support the WHMIS agenda? On-site inspection at the work area, same thing. We could do an inspection, walk around and talk about, our findings, right, in a shop, for example, or other areas. And we could also provide a service. Sometimes, clients would ask, I want to exchange this product to this one. Can you help me to review the safety data sheets? And what do you think? Do we need to have additional personal protective equipment or additional controls to use this specific chemical? So we could also help you to kind of figure out, about the safety data sheet, how to read it, and give you some recommendation based on your provided safety data sheets. Provide additional training to demonstrate safe handling of chemicals. Sometimes some chemicals more dangerous than the other. So if you need to have some kind of specialized training for it, we could help you with the development and implementation of it. Help develop workplace label. There is still, I see lots of times people don't understand what is a workplace label, so we could help you to develop those if you need it for some of your products. Recommendation for proper storage and control or spillage. So for example, we're looking at maybe flammable materials, or we may be looking at storages, for example, the isocyanate-based products, where we have to be considered it's a designated substance. Review in-house WHMIS training material. We could look at it, and based on the hazards, what you have, we could provide you recommendations, and we could also help if you don't really have any specific training in-house, you just have a general training, which Aina mentioned that lots of time organizations now turn into online training for WHMIS. So that's kind of a generalized training, talks about WHMIS, but you're required to do actually in-house training for somebody to explain the hazards and what to do, you know, when they are exposed. What are the controls, for example? So if you need help with the development of that training material, we are also able to provide you some help.
Okay, awesome. So during an inspection, if a ministry occupational hygienist recognizes non-compliance or we need more information, we may issue requirements, for example, to produce WHMIS training records, either for a specific worker or a group of workers, or maybe for all the workers. We may issue orders for retraining, and we'll be pretty specific about what training is actually required. Including these information about these HPA amendments. And the orders, again, could be time-based or tied to a stop work, which would in this case involve stopping use of a particular product, maybe, or they could be tied to a compliance plan. Alrighty. So for resources to prepare for the WHMIS inspection campaign, the ministry's website has a guide to the WHMIS regulation, as well as the full regulation posted on the site. And the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety is a valuable resource when it comes to WHMIS. They provide support to workplaces and also to inspectors. And if you have questions about either campaign, really, you can contact our Health and Safety Contact Center by phone or by email.
So these are some of the resources you could find on the website. Amendment to Hazardous Product Regulation, International Agency Research Center has a good documents you could read about the exposure, occupational prevention, occupational disease risk and key industries, protecting workers from health. So this would be specific to wood and paper pulp industry. And just general CCOH has a very good document about wood dust and the health effect of wood dust. So that's something should be reviewed. You know, everybody who is actually working in the wood industry is just kind of give you a background information. You know, why are we taking wood dust so seriously when we're talking about occupational exposures?
Alrighty, so that concludes the webinar.
I would just like to thank Aina and Judith for joining us this afternoon. It doesn't look like we have any audience questions, so I think we can give some time back to our audience. So thanks again for attending today's webinar. Just a reminder, a copy of the presentation and the recording will be emailed to you within the next few days. Thanks again and have a safe day. Bye.